Chapter 1 Video Presentation. The key important themes of this chapter start with the origins of philosophy. The origins of philosophy were in the streets with Socrates surrounded by his students. This is perhaps the intended use and discussion of philosophy. A quote from the chapter that best proves my previous point is found on page 1. It reads, "Philosophy, as a rigorous form of reflection and thinking, was not initially confined to schools or academies or institutions, but was an innate part of our communal life." This coincides with the idea that humans are social creatures and look to each other to examine and discuss their thoughts and actions. In other words, why we are the way we are. A quote further down page 1 also touches upon this. Philosophy was born of the immediacy of life's problems and required, as it still does, thoughtful interaction with those around us. This is an important point in the beginning of the chapter because from the start it implies that the framework of philosophy is for everyone and anyone to participate in. Philosophical thought and discussion, which perhaps contrasts the popular belief that it is reserved for those of high academic status. The majority of the rest of the chapter discusses the development of a skewed racial class system that followed after World War II, when white GIs were prospering due to the GI Bill, while countless others were suffering and still are just because of the color of their skin. The years following World War II were prosperous, that is, if you fit into the right parameters. Limitations for many non-whites in the following years included the practices of redlining and segregation, the limitations of a strict class system, and the availability and accessibility to jobs. Additionally, enrollment in college drastically increased during the years following World War II due to a lowered cost of tuition. But again, this privilege was only accessible to those who fit in those previously mentioned parameters of race. These inequalities, the chapter argues, were the historical origins of urban philosophy. 2 decades later, the years surrounding the civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War prove that the post-World War II era was a time of significant social transformation, as cited on page 5. The underlying point I am trying to prove here is that the increase in an educated population that we saw immediately following World War II led to this same educated population of young adults questioning the societal norms during the 50s and 60s. Later, in the years following the 1970s, the author argues that among Black communities, self-destructive behaviors became rampant. The author argues on page 5 that these patterns of behavior can be explained by the culture of poverty. That is to say that these patterns of behavior develop as a means for self-preservation in an environment that threatens one's life, regardless of the fact that these hostile living conditions were created by redlining practices. This argument is best proved by a quote at the top of page 6. It reads, "If you are excluded from the social contract from the start, you are deprived of the rule of law, which is the basis of civil society. So why would you respect that same society and its rules if it has never protected or respected you?" I argue that the underlying meaning here is that racial discrimination leads to a population of criminals. Fast forward to the past 2 decades. The once dangerous notion of the word urban and the fear of major cities such as Philadelphia and New York City it created have changed. The teens of the 90s and 2000s that were born into undiverse, white-bread suburban areas, such as myself from Long Island, for example, began to move back into cities due to the changed definition of urban from dangerous to edgy. Now these areas are seen as desirable to live in. This is better known as the process of gentrification, as argued on page 9. In the past 20 years, the center of poverty has shifted. Previously, in the 40s and 60s, wealthy whites moved to suburbs, while poor people of color occupied urban areas. Now, more people below the poverty line are living in the suburbs, while rich whites move to the city. Lastly, the main argument and point of the chapter wraps up nicely on pages 11 and 10. The author writes, "The purpose of urban philosophy is to examine issues that grow out of American metropolitan areas and largely affect communities of color. Furthermore, urban philosophy is a return to a notion of philosophy that is open for everyone, meaning making up lost ground by exploring topics often excluded from the canon. For urban philosophers, this means considering the dilemmas of class, race, and exploitation in America. This further proves the point that philosophy is no longer just for the elites.